Today I'm joined by Razib Khan. Razib is a population geneticist, a writer, an owner-operator of a very compelling Substack, and the host of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. Welcome, Razib.
Hey, nice to be here, Alex.
It's great to finally chat to you. This meeting has been a long time coming. I've been really
Yeah.
excited to talk to you. One thing that I wanted to ask you about is it's the coconut emoji on your Twitter. How does it feel to be kind of a self-conscious exponent of the multiracial whiteness meme?
How does it feel? Just it's one of those things where I always knew that that's what I was. There were a lot of signs when I was younger. When I was 5, I made myself a lot of mayonnaise sandwiches, and I didn't really understand why I was doing these sorts of things. Now, periodically I would eat bland food, and as I grew older, I started to realize, I might present as brown on the outside, but my soul was somewhat different. And so I've kind of realized that I am a coconut and that I am white on the inside. And, I'm just asking people to accept my identity as I understand it and not erase me. So it's been a good consciousness raising moment for me. And I've met a lot of people out there who felt the same.
Yeah, I think it's interesting for you probably to see the meme of multiracial whiteness now expand beyond your house, and include all sorts of other people. Like
Uh-huh.
what how does that make you feel? The fact that you're not alone anymore, that this is a concept now, that many people are multiracially white.
Yeah, it makes me feel less special. On the other hand, this is a really insane world, and so all things are possible. I'm not surprised by any of it. I kind of am willing to entertain anything. And so if you were going to tell me someone was multiracial white, uh, and also indigenous, and also an alien from the planet Zorkon, I would have to entertain it today because, the ultimate reality is within. That's the insight of 2021.
Yeah, I'll given that this is the subversive podcast, I'll just hit the ground running with the extra spicy stuff. And I know you've written about this in the past, on IQ as a useful metric, and I'm
Okay.
curious what you think. Because now there's a lot of conversations about meritocracy and what it involves to have a meritocratic system, and how do you think the idea of IQ or the measure of IQ, or I know it's a complicated measure, and not, IQ in itself is not the most robust way of measuring intelligence, but it correlates with a lot of things.
hmm
How do you think that plays into how we view meritocracy in our time today?
Okay. Well, I think this is going to be a weird recommendation in light of his recent opinions, but Nassim Taleb has a book called "Fooled by Randomness," which came out in the mid 2000s, and that was actually before Black Swan and the other stuff that was super popular. And what Fooled by Randomness shows is that there's a lot of outcomes in life that are due to random chance events. And so what was happening in the mid 2000s is there were books like The Millionaire Next Door, which were telling you this is what you do to become a millionaire. But they didn't show the people who did those things who didn't become millionaires. So there might be some necessary or probabilistic conditions of becoming a millionaire, but many people who meet those conditions won't become millionaires. So the point there is to go to the finding that the correlation between IQ, intelligence, standardized testing, and income is about 0.5. So that means that there are people who are very smart, who are poor, and people who aren't too smart, who are rich. Who could be in the latter example? Because people often want to know. There's some hardworking people who are in professions and trades like plumbing, realtor. They might not score very well on an IQ test, but they can do their job, and if they work hard, they network, they get lucky, they can be very well off. I know to people like this. On the other hand, there are people who I know with high IQs who aren't as conscientious sometimes, or just got a couple of bad breaks, and their income is considerably lower than you would expect from their IQ. So IQ is very useful, but there are limitations. When people say, though, that it just tests how well you want to do on a test, well, I mean, even if that was true, how well you do on a test actually matters a lot in your life in the modern world. We're not farmers, in 1800 anymore. Although even when it comes to something like skilled labor, I think IQ probably does matter some. But the ability to engage in abstraction, to read, to think, to analyze, to decompose, all of these things are very useful in the modern world in terms of white collar work, pink collar work, even for to give a concrete example. This isn't IQ as such, but it's just the human capital endowments of literacy. Having a literate population tends to be good for manufacturing takeoff. So this was one of the reasons that East Asian economies were so well positioned for this export-oriented manufacturing takeoff. You had a bunch of employees, and they could all read instructions, they could all read signs. Now, this isn't the case everywhere. So Bangladesh, where I was born, the literacy rate is lower, or was lower. I think it's now in the 80s. It's gotten considerably higher. But they've done okay, but their manufacturing takeoff, their export-oriented led growth, has, it runs into human capital limitations. So compared to Vietnam, which was poorer in 1990 than Bangladesh, and now is definitely an Asian tiger, Vietnam, because of its Confucian heritage, it was strongly influenced, I think, was it either the Nguyen or the Tran dynasty. They shifted over from Buddhism as a legitimating ideology to Neo-Confucianism, and so they emphasized literacy, education of the populace. So you had a population that was already well endowed human capital-wise to lift off. In terms of IQ more generally, when we say IQ, we really mean the G factor, general intelligence, which is the correlation across tests. And so any given test is not a perfect measure of IQ, but it's correlated with an underlying construct we call IQ. The main criticism from the point of view of physical scientists is it's a phenomenon. It's not a concrete entity. You can try to reduce it down, and some cognitive neuroscientists and psychometricians have, to things like, it's like, something related to neuron connections, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is more of a philosophical enterprise, in my opinion, because it doesn't really matter. What matters is operationally, can you use it to predict things? And you can, and people do. In the United States, because of disparate impact, officially IQ tests are banned. And so what people use are things like selective university admissions and graduations. Now, since those are getting rid of, these sorts of tests, they're going to figure out a different workaround. But the reality is there isn't one true IQ test like the Stanford Binet that defines IQ. You can find a lot of other tests, a lot of other instruments to measure this statistic and to get a general sense of it. To give you a concrete example, I think I can tell this story because I don't think people can identify who this person is, but because a lot of universities are getting rid of the general admission or the general records examination, the GRE, for graduate school. This was happening before COVID. COVID kind of accelerated it. But, I had a friend, he's a professor, and he opposed getting rid of it, but he said, well, I have a pretty high status lab. I'm just going to look at where they go as undergrads. Okay? In terms of that's a good predictor. And so he'll just use that, So they got rid of the GRE, but instead all they did is replaced it arguably with probably a more class inflected measure that still has some correlation to standardized test score.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the hot topic at the moment. Abolishing standardized testing in general, and kind of how these holistic measures that they're going to be bringing in, which essentially just sounds like whatever the administration wants to influence. I'm curious if you think that people are going to default to heuristics, where do these kids come from, or do you think it's just going to be nepotism all the way, or just a door open to corruption?
I think it's going to be a combination of both. For example, when it comes to your doctor, your lawyer, you're going to look at the university, but then people are going to look at demographic factors in terms of just assuming that. Here's an argument for why getting rid of the GRE was bad. the knock-on unintended consequences. Florida got rid of the checkbox. Have you ever been a felon? Whatever, in prison. She was a UT Austin economist. I forget her name now. I think Dole something. Anyway, Jennifer Dole something. But this economist at UT Austin found actually getting rid of this checkbox resulted in disparate impact where there was more discrimination by employers against Black Americans. Because what happened is you don't know who has been to prison or not, and so you run the numbers implicitly based on race. And so when you had that box, the Black Americans that did not go to prison were clearly identified to the employers, and they weren't as impacted by that perception. And so when you get rid of the graduate records examination, when you get rid of all of these, relative, I'm not going to say objective, but relatively neutral, which is, I think, a more accurate way to say it. What's going to happen is people are going to use other cues and indicators. So, for example, Chris Rock, late 20th century philosopher, had a really great Saturday Night Live sketch about positive stereotypes, And I'm not going to do the whole voice. Don't want to get you canceled. Even in Romania, the long arm can go there. But, he was basically like, he doesn't understand why certain groups complain about positive stereotypes. So he's just like, Jews, you guys are complaining about people saying that you're good with money. Asians, you guys are complaining that people saying you're smart. Like, I don't get this. Like, as a Black guy, like, I would love it if people were just saying, cheat off the Black guy, And so what he was getting at there is people have some stereotypes, some certain perceptions about demographics, ethnic groups. And so my story I will give is like many, many years ago, back during the George W. Bush administration, I actually applied for a job and I gave him a code sample. And as I was working on a project, my supervisor, my manager said something where I was like, oh, but that was in my code sample. So you know that I could do that, right? And he's like, oh, I didn't look at the code sample. And I was like, why don't you look at the code sample? And he's just like, well, we just kind of looked at you and we just assumed that you could code. And so I was just like, all right. And so I think what it was like, there's a certain perception of people that look like me and what we can do. And that's worked out positively in a lot of ways for me. But it shouldn't, as anyone who's worked with Indian coders who are not good coders. I mean, some people come out of these universities without too much like hands-on experience. So the stereotype is not always accurate. Again, I said IQ is 50% correlated with income. There's always a residual. There were always people that are not hitting your expectations. And so I think the goal here is kind of like, Billy Beane had this idea of Moneyball, that was written about for the Oakland Days, where you use your metrics to try to zero in on people who are undervalued. But if you get rid of metrics, how are you going to do that? Right? And so, I mean, that's the ultimate thing. I think the implicit idea that's being promoted here is that there is no talent, there is no difference of ability. Everything is equal. And so, I'm a full accelerationist troll about this. I just think that everyone should be allowed into graduate school by lottery. Because everyone's equally talented, right? Now, I say this to the face, like I say this on Twitter to academics, and they don't really respond. The reason they don't respond is they don't want to admit that that's just false, because there's an ideology right now that's just like ludicrous on the face of it, that all people, have talent in all ways. Now, people aren't going to say that everyone can be in the NBA, okay? Like, they have their limitations, but somehow everyone can be a professor. Now, believe it or not, it's hard. It's not like being LeBron James. It's not like being in the NBA, but being an academic, I mean, even most people who get PhDs don't end up in tenured positions, especially tenured positions at universities where they make, substantive impact on the research world. So, and in fact, the ones that are going to be remembered 50 years from now, I bet you like fewer scientists will be remembered 50 years from now than NBA players alive today. Like, in terms of the people who have impact. Like, who do we remember from the 1950s? You can probably, like 100. You name 100, that's like 95% of the mind share, 99% of the mind share. And so how you pick your scientists, I think, is kind of important, but, other people disagree. I mean, in public, a lot of it's fake. A lot of it's preference falsification, Tim Curran's concept.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because you kind of have that perspective of you deal with these people, you've kind of at least tangentially tied to academia. You talk to them every day on Twitter, you debate them. How much preference falsification do you think there is? Because I feel like a lot of this information, is not necessarily that controversial between academics, but it is very controversial when academics are speaking to a lay public. Like there's a lot of gatekeeping on, information on meta narratives that, are not safe for public consumption.
Yeah. I mean, so I keep a lot of that. I keep a lot of it to myself, partly because if someone who's an academic decides to denounce me and I know things about them, I'll just divulge what I know. So to be entirely frank, I've been open about that as a preemptive strike. Please, I know you have a reputation, a bigger reputation than me, and I've heard things about you, and I will just divulge it to my 35,000 followers if you decide to come at me. So it's like keep the information, keep all your texts, keep all your DMs. And use it against people. Now, if you're a normal person, if you're a normie, you don't have to deal with this. But so I did a podcast with my friend Colin Wright. He is an arch binarist. I don't know if you know of Colin. He's managing editor at Quillette, and he is a proponent of this controversial concept called the sex binary. And but he said, he has friends who were making fun of. Academic friends who are making fun of what he called gender ideology. I don't know too much about it, so I'll use Colin's terms, but I'm not saying that I really know much about what this means. And now they're denouncing him and all these things, and he has records of what they thought, right? And so it's important to always do that, I think. In terms of gatekeeping, so I think part of the issue with academia today, and it's gotten way more woke since I left officially in 2016, part of the issue is there's a lot of conformity and a lot of groupthink, partly because the way the system works, it's institutional, it's not just the people. If you live by your grant, and your grant is approved by your peers within your discipline, okay? So if you piss off your peers, you're not going to get the grant, okay? And also another thing that's happening is just groupthink. I think like Taleb calls it the firehouse effect, where people are all start of converging and homogenizing on the same thought. And then, of course, you can never be too far left. So, I have friends and acquaintances who were terrified of admitting that they were positively inclined towards the right-wing Democratic candidate Pete Buttigieg in the primaries. That was I've never talked to anyone who supported Biden, in the primaries in academia. But I did know some people who were on the far right who did support Pete, who did support Mayor Pete. And one of them tweeted out a support of Mayor Pete, and he got a lot of crap, and I DM'd him, and I was like, wow, you're brave, man. And he's like, yeah, it's been tough. I mean, we were like only half joking. Because basically the median was Bernie, and to the left of Bernie is, of course, the DSA and all those other people. And then if you're kind of quasi-Republican, you were a Warren supporter. Okay? I'm not joking. Like, I have a friend who was like a big Warren stan, and he's always accused of being a quasi-Republican because he believes in market principles. Anyway, he has a background. He has a more diverse ideological or disciplinary background than most biologists, and so he believes in the workings of the market, but he is a liberal. But so like he's accused of being a quasi-Republican. So you have this homogeneity that's gotten way more extreme, and there are more conservatives or more right-leaning people in academia than you would think, but most of them are deep undercover, and they let people think what they want to think, and it's really strong. I used to put conservative in my Twitter handle. I got rid of it because most scientists thought that it was an ironic joke, and I kind of got sick of explaining that it's actually not an ironic joke. And then it was to the point where I'm not going to name who this is, but there's one, I wouldn't consider myself traditionally socially conservative in the American way, like I'm not opposed to abortion rights or anything like that. Although I am conservative in other ways socially. But in any case, especially over the last 5 years, okay? Because if the last 5 years, if you don't move, if you just stay in place, you become really, really right wing. But anyway, so they're socially conservative in a kind of traditional way, and they're the only biologist that I know who's like this. I think I know a couple of others, but they're not prominent. This person is prominent, and I was at their institution, this elite research institution, and I emailed them like, "Hey, I'm here for business, for work. Do you want to have coffee?" And they were like, "Sure." And I was like, I said, I just want to talk to you because, we're on the same wavelength. She's like, "Wait, you're conservative?" And I was like, "Well, it was in my handle." And the person was like, "Yeah, I wondered about that. I didn't know what to make of it." So this person themselves are conservative, but when they saw it in my handle, their prior expectation was so strong, they also could not believe it. And so that's just to give you an extent of like how people signal. So, to some extent they signal, some people, considerable number of people signal that they're further left than other people. And I'll give you another example. And this is not going to be identifiable, so it's fine. So it's because I'm open about my views, which is very rare. A lot of scientists, and almost all of them, not all, like probably like 98% of them are further to the left of me. But they're off the reservation somehow, and they need someone to talk to. They can't trust anyone, so they'll DM me. And so I get to know a lot of these people, their heterodoxies. I'm also really good at sniffing out heterodoxies, which terrifies people because whatever. I mean, I'm just good because like I have a huge data set of people, and I see what types of people are actually off the res. But so this guy messages me, and basically like I have forums and stuff where I'm like, you can go here and be safe. And it turns out that there's someone else in this forum where like they message me and they're just like, "This person's an SJW, like you have a mole, you need to get them out of here." And I have messaged back and I'm like, "Actually, I know him better than I know you. He's a real life friend of mine. He's definitely like the empirical gap between he and I is 0. Okay, we have the same view. And so my friend was like, he's more my acquaintance at the time. He was shocked because to give you some context, they were actually in the same lab for a while. And so both of that, the friend who was believed that there was an SJW mole, he's actually to the left of the putative SJW mole. But that guy was so good at just letting people think what they wanted to think that that's what they thought about him. But actually he's as based as I am, to be frank. So there are people like this. Now I will say I'm pessimistic about their persistence once they're in academia, because what ends up happening is the lie becomes the truth. So, there are people I've talked to, they've slowly evolved in their thinking, they're still evolving in their thinking. And eventually I can tell that their lies are now sincere truths to them. Because their mental Overton window starts shifting. So, if you're like you're only talking to Razib and you're in your own like little mental box, you're not getting the full range of input, and you're in this milieu where the social incentives are really strong to change your ideology, and you do. And so naturally what happens is you change your ideology, and then you think you've always had that ideology. So I have one friend, I think we're ex-friends now. I'm not really into being friends with him for various reasons. He's gone full woke, but he was very, very not woke even like 3 or 4 years ago. And I think just for his professional advancement, I think it's just been easier for him to just kind of convert and kind of give up the ghost there. I think he sincerely actually is woke now. I think he would be shocked if I pointed out some of the facts of what he has said to me many years ago. I don't think he would say things like, "Oh, I've changed my views." I think he would probably be shocked and like, I think he's probably forgotten, to be frank. And I think this is how human psychology works. Like if you trace the views of people in the white Americans in the South, white Americans in general in the 1960s, their views on civil rights, and there were some, I think Kandel at Columbia and his work on memory did some of it. Basically what happened is 10 to 20 years later, these white Americans, they all remember themselves as being in the liberal minority. Like the majority of them that were tracked over time believed that they were in the minority. But if you actually track them, you see a considerable number of them had majoritarian beliefs on race and segregation. But they don't remember that by the early 1980s. By the early 1980s, they think of themselves as being the brave white liberals that were against segregation in the 1960s. And so I think, this is like a common human tendency. Like, you don't want to accept that you were just conforming to the majority, right? And so I think to resolve that cognitive dissonance, you're just going to re-edit your past. I think this is common. This is like a long time ago. I had a friend, and we're really close friends, so I know like a lot about her personal life. And she was talking about the men she had slept with, and she'd left 2 off. And I was just like, what about that? She's like, oh, I don't count those. And I was like, okay, that's fine. But then I realized, if I didn't know her as well, I wouldn't have known about those too. And she wasn't even consciously lying to me. There were reasons she didn't count those guys, in her, quote, official count. And so I think this is just like a common human tendency that's cropping up from what I see in human psychology and our broader social culture in the United States.
Yeah, it is really interesting because, the same phenomenon I see kind of happening in tech, which is also another very woke space that I've lived in for a while. And it is interesting kind of now I'm a little bit outside of it. I still work in the kind of tangential industry, but I live far away. Now I'm outspoken about my views. And it's interesting kind of how much of a magnet I am to people who were, just normie woke people that worked in these companies and had absolutely, I wouldn't have intuited that they had any sort of dissident thought or any sort of, speaking out against anything. And then, they're in my DMs telling me about, all of the dark stuff that they can't tell anyone else. And it is really interesting because it's never the people you think,
Yeah. Well, I mean, when the incentives are really strong, people are going to conform. And so, I mean, I think one thing that I would say is, like, I try to be compassionate, and I try to be the best, I try not to be like a petty person. So I understand that a lot of these people will also turn, to be frank. I mean, they have their moments, but at the end of the day, they're not going to stand up to a mob. There's a lot of people who have heterodoxies, who have worries, who have concerns, but ultimately they conform, right? And I'm no longer disappointed when I see them behaving in ways online. And I don't think it's a preference falsification all the time. I think sometimes people have heterodoxies, but then they just get convinced, They just get convinced by the doctors of the church, by their readings. So, I mean, for example, like the gender stuff, I don't pay much attention to it because I hope that it'll blow over. There's only so many things that I have bandwidth for. But, I read about the evolution of sex and biology and all these things many years ago. I don't think they've learned anything new, so I don't care what my friends in evolutionary biology say when they try to explain it to me, because I just don't think that it's based on new facts. I think it's based on new interpretive frameworks that's been stuffed down their throat, and so they accept it. And that's fine. I don't really care. There are people in Saudi Arabia who have their own framework of why it's actually good to do parallel cousin marriage. I don't care. I know it on some intellectual level, but I'm not going to get super interested in it because I don't think that it has staying power, because I don't think that they really understand what they're even saying half the time. So as you know, I mean, it's really not coherent a lot of the time in terms of, like, you have an identity that needs to be affirmed, but it's not biological. And do you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's gender essentialist and anti-essentialist at the same time, and
yeah, gender is a performance, but you also feel it inside your soul.
Yeah. Like, you have like a female, it's like, basically when I was growing up back in my day, as my daughter would make fun of me for saying, there were tomboys, and we didn't think that they were not girls; they were called tomboys. And now I see stuff online where it's like, oh, so and so is riding around in a truck. I know what's her name? Ellen Page. So he now. I saw something on Twitter where it was like they were in elementary school. He was in elementary school. She was in elementary school then, and they were on some, like, I don't know. It was like a boy's toy, and someone was like, "See, like, they were always like this," and I'm just like, I mean, there was always that that boy who was on the pink big wheel, most of the time it's because his parents were dumb or they were cheap, and so they were like, the pink big wheel is like 50% cheaper, so they got him the pink big wheel, and he really wanted to be on the big wheel, so he was like, whatever, you're 6 or 7, it's not that big of a deal, it's just like a little funny. That has nothing to do with what his gender is as an adult or even his sexual orientation. Most of the time he was, wasn't gay. I mean, we were thinking of that, but there's some kids who probably kind of knew they were different. But I mean, it was just like, there was a lot of trivial things when you're growing up that have nothing to do with your identity, that are just circumstance. And I just think that people are now backdating or like backfilling a lot of these reasons and these causes. This is my perception as an outsider without any like deep thought on this. Because like I said, my goal is to just avoid thinking about it until it moves on, or I move out of the country, I guess.
Yeah, that's one way of solving it, complete exit. I feel the scary thing about it is that they really are coming for the kids. Like, I remember I just saw a picture of like Elliot Page just reclining somewhere that looked like a dentist's office, and it was like, I don't know, something about, support trans kids or something, and I'm like, trans kids, I feel like that's there's being a lot of people are pushing the trans kids agenda quite a lot, and obviously on the conservative side, people are obviously very concerned with why that's happening, but I don't know. I mean, it is super weird to me that this is the only spot where children are assigned like complete agency over their bodies and things like that. You don't let kids vote. You don't let kids have sex or drink alcohol or take drugs, but you do let them completely do like absolute body modification on the basis of a hunch or of a toy preference or something. And it is pretty, I don't know, disconcerting that this is like trying to be mainstream now.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I try to temper my alarmism and think that from the vast majority of parents, like, there's limits. Thermidor always does happen. There always tends to be a counter reaction. History doesn't go it up. So our fellow Substacker Noah Smith, who I have agreements and disagreements with, wrote a piece about how social conservatives actually won the culture war. Now, I think this is a question of who won in what way needs to be explored deeply, because I think it's too easy. I think in general liberals did win. That's my opinion. But there are things that you can point to which are like striking to me, which I didn't realize. So I watched Fast Times at Ridgemont High a long time ago, but I reread the summary and because I'd forgotten some plot notes. This is in the early 1980s. And one of the characters, one plot line involves with her going to make an appointment in an abortion clinic, and she ends up having an abortion. And it's not like it's not like a very special episode of France Times at Ridgemont High. She just had an abortion. Okay, that's just something you do. And so to me, I was like, oh, like this is one way where the pro-life movement has totally transformed social expectations, because you wouldn't have like a scene in a film today, at least a mainstream teen sex comedy, which I don't think they make anymore, but it's like just going to have an abortion. So something with, and I've talked to people older than me, sex in the 1970s and into the early 80s, like, before the hardcore, like, ascendance of the Reagan era and social conservatism, they were like really liberated in a way that we like younger Gen X and millennials can't understand. Like we like got the videos about like, if you have premarital sex, you'll die of AIDS. Now that was like not really based on truth. Fomento was correct about the AIDS, straight HIV, moral panic, but this is the kind of stuff that we got. Whereas in the 70s and early 80s, I think it was more of an Animal House kind of like, let all things be. And like I had a teacher who said, back in our day, in the 1970s, he said, in the early 70s, he said, they didn't care about, basically after Roe v. Wade, so it was like after 1972, and before AIDS, between 72 and the early 80s, you just took a shot if you got a venereal disease, and there was abortion and there was birth control pills. And so there was this period of, frankly, like a lot of libertinism, and that kind of faded away. And so I don't necessarily think it's always like top-down cultural mores. Like there could be like limiting principles. There's an underlying like limiting principle to this sort of like libertinism, but I do think that faded away. So things can change and go in a more quote conservative direction. And the terms conservative and liberal can be kind of weird, But basically, history doesn't always move in one direction. It zigs and zags, kind of swings back. As we know, like if you look at late 18th century Europe and sexual mores, they were way more, I think we would say, lax than the exoteric norm by the Victorian era.
Yeah. It is interesting now because in principle now the norms are probably as liberal as they've ever have been, especially with sex work being normalized and everything being normalized in the sense that shame is thoroughly exercised from the public domain, but people also aren't really having that much sex. It's it's a weird connection between the taboo and actually wanting to do it.
Sort of, and also like the age and power thing means like you can do whatever you want with whoever you want, and the accept conditions are getting bigger and bigger, right? So it's like, there was like weird people on Twitter, and like this isn't just weird people on Twitter, but what happens on Twitter eventually becomes mainstream. So you got to take note of it, where it's like they think it's disgusting that you would ever have a sexual relationship with anyone who's less than or more than like 1 year apart in age from you. Like if you do stipulate that as the norm, people are just going to have less sex because the partner space is going to shrink, especially outside of urban areas. There are a lot of academics who ended up marrying their postdoc or their graduate student today, who are Gen X and older, and that's an extremely taboo action today. And so there's some kind of tension there where it's like people don't want to denounce their colleagues, so they're not saying anything. But I mean.
Yeah,
even who are
meeting
you
a
going to interact
spouse
with?
at work. Yeah, even that's completely taboo now, which used to be pretty much how you met a spouse back then.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that there's a lot of restrictions and constraints now on the so-called like liberalism. Like basically freedom with restrictions that's always true. But the question is like, what is the parameter space of the freedom and the restrictions? And you can do anything, like you could say, for example, you can do anything anywhere with someone your exact same age. So that's liberal because you could do anything. Whatever kink you have, there's no shame for the kink. But you got to find that person. And now they've limited the space of who you can find. And so this is my understanding. Like, 'cause I haven't been dating since, again, like the first Bush term, the early Bush term. Like I've been in a relationship. So for me, this is all abstract, but I've seen people my age who continue dating, the changes that they've seen, and also younger people. Like I can tell you when I went to graduate school a little late, and so people were about a decade younger than me. So they were like more like mid-millennials. And a lot of them were, to be frank, when I got to know them, way less sexually experienced than people in my generation, who are 10 years older in their mid-20s. And I know in hindsight, I'm pretty sure we were less sexually experienced than people 10 years, like older Gen X, like the Brett Kavanaugh generation. So that was one of the things with, I don't know if you kept track of it, but the whole Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court thing, I think it is correct that one of the issues that Kavanaugh had is he comes out of like the peak period of libertinism, and, whatever you believe about the details of the allegations, there was a lot of stuff that went on in the early 1980s, that were depicted in film that we would find really, quote, problematic. So, for example, I think this is 84, the film Revenge of the Nerds, the protagonist, he switches his identity. It's like some sort of costume party. He switches his identity, and he has sex with this woman that he really wants to have sex with by pretending to be her boyfriend. And it was like a big funny thing. Okay, this nerd had got to have sex with a cheerleader, and by the end of it, she decided to stay with him because he was a better lover. But I mean, I think today they would not write that in the script. Like that's considered rape today. I think that is just like having sex with someone by falsifying who you are, right? In that way. So, but this stuff was normative back then. I met a guy who's a boomer. I think he was a boomer, but he was at Woodstock, and he was like, he got in trouble because he was in his 20s at the time, and he was trying to hook up with a 13-year-old, and the 13-year-old's brother got super mad at him, and so he was like a big biker dude. He chased him down, beat the crap out of him, knocked him out, and raped him in a bush. And so my acquaintance, he was a professor, he came to. He was being raped by this young woman's older brother. And there was like some Hendrix song going. So it came up because he's like, he has really negative association with the Hendrix song because that was happening. And so he's just like, and I was just like, that's freaky. And he said, you don't really know what happened in the 60s because they talk about the good parts. They talk about kind of like free love and peace. But everything was on the table for a couple of years. Everything was on the table. So he talked about chasing a 13-year-old when he was in his mid-20s. So he was older. He was like silent generation, I guess. But anyways, he talked about this without like that much shame. And he said, I know that, you probably judge me. This was in like the 1990s. He was telling some of us, some of his students. And he's like, but you have to understand, like in the late 60s, we thought free love was free. And that just wasn't that big of a deal. It wasn't taboo at all. He kind of resented that the guy got mad, that the older brother got mad. So I'm just telling you the story that there's a lot of history that is not surfaced to us because people try to kind of repackage things in a more anodyne way. So the late 60s, like crime spike, reflected a level of social and cultural chaos that we don't empirically I think as younger people really know, partly because the films and everything like that kind of, it's like World War II. A lot of us don't intuit how gory World War II was because in the United States, at least, the movies make it much more septic, or like antiseptic. You don't see, like, except for like Saving Private Ryan, like a lot of the older films, you don't see how gory it was.
Yeah, that's quite a shocking story, man. But yeah, I think that's true. Like a lot of what I see now with consent culture and trying to bring in this kind of almost like Protestant prudery through the back door in the form of just pure liberalism and trying to constrain the relationship between you and the other person. Without saying, okay, this is what God wants, but this is under the norm of consent. And then you also have things like, the idea of catching feelings. And, it's like, you can have sex with like this weird, affirmative consent model where you're always kind of at risk from the other person not consenting and you not understanding what they want and they not understanding what you want. But it's all kind of in these super strict parameters where you're also you don't have any obligation towards the other person. So if for example, I want to have sex to have a relationship with someone, that's kind of off the table because that's not part of the liberal model. It's like, you better not be catching feelings right now because this is, you're not doing it right if you are. It's I don't know. It's a bit of a maddening system because a lot of the stuff that used to be on the table is now off the table because it's considered too onerous for the free individual.
Yeah, I think one reason that some people are going towards more traditional arrangements. So I don't know. Have you had Justin Murphy on this podcast yet?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, Justin. He's doing, of course, he's got a culturally appropriate. Brown traditions, with the arranged marriage thing. But the reason that stuff like this is coming up is because, people need alternatives. The systems and just like the norms that were set up in the late 20th century, they've just spun out of control. Because there was a period where, dating was fun and it was relaxing and it could lead to getting married. I'm married, like I met my spouse in college and, I was, it was a natural thing. And now it just seems really stressful because all of the rules have just like cramped in and scaffolded everything, and everything is too like it's basically like it's like nothing matters and so everything matters, if that makes sense, where it's just like everything is just really high strung from what I see in the date of people who want to have a relationship, right? Like, now, if you don't want to have a relationship, I think you're good to go. And the reality is there's a lot of people who go through life phase where they don't want to have a relationship, so they're happy then, but then once they go to the next phase, they're not happy. And so we have this situation where I think the cultural norms like kind of satisfy only a subset of people's life cycle, and so only a small number of people are quite happy with them at the given time, and then they go to the next stage and they're like, okay, like what do I do now? Like there's no exit. The whole dating market is just it's like we have all these technologies now. If you're a certain type of person, the technologies are really good. So I have friends that are in their 30s that are pretty successful professionals, and that are men, and they have issues with just basically like too many options, because there's like a lot of women who want to settle down then, and they have the statistics, they have like the incomes, the equity, the wealth, all of the things that you want on paper, and so and they kind of get annoyed by the attention they get, partly because they didn't get it in their 20s, because in their 20s they're like young and they're people don't take them seriously. These women think that they don't want to settle down, so it's just kind of like things have changed overnight for a lot of people that I know once they go beyond 30, if they're men, as long as they're fit and doing okay in general. But they're not psychologically ready for it. And, obviously that's not most people. Like most people are not, moderately, at least minimally fit, 30-something male professionals, right? There's all these other types of people who are not getting their needs served in this dating market, from what I can see. But I have to say, like that group, they can choose and do what they want from what I have seen.
Yeah.
I mean, they complain to me about like too many options, and I'm like, dude, shut up.
Yeah. I think
That's not a real
they're
complaint.
they're kind of right in a way, in the sense that it's really hard to, even if they were to be inclined to settle down and have a family and stuff, you kind of I don't know, your brain turns to mush after a while, because you're looking for someone who has the complete package. But now about all the features, about 20 different aspects that you find in each woman, that's absolutely great, and you just want to find one that has them all, and then you
Yes.
just kind of churn through it, and obviously none of them none of them has a whole checklist.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like I said, it's really abstract for me. I mean, I've just observed things that have left me just like really shocked and confused. In terms of people that I know, and like why. I mean, like, what is going on in our culture that these people want to be married or want to be in a relationship? They're still single, and they're unhappy. And we have all these technology, we have all this money, we have all this consumer goods, and people are still left empty.
Yeah. I mean, for on the side of the women, it's probably even more distressing, because the as time goes on, you a lot of women can get dates with these guys, but they don't really want to settle down with them. And then if you're a 30-something woman, that's probably a high up on the list, finding someone you want to spend more time with, at least have a long-term relationship. And then you get a little bit crazy after the 20th date, where the guy doesn't call you back, and you think, oh God, why am I defective? And then obviously these guys end up dating these same women, and they're like, okay, these women are unstable. Yeah, they're unstable because they've been through through the ringer with these
Yeah.
apps and all that.
No, I have a friend who I mean, he's not, unfortunately, because I think he'd be a good dad. He's basically stopped having really. I mean, he's a really successful engineer, and he's not Asperger's or autistic, although he's a little weird. But he basically stopped dating and now just like has his hobbies, because he can't be bothered with relationships, because he can't deal with the stress of like dating women, where it's like I mean, he's when he stopped dating, he was in his mid-30s, and he was one of the ones who like clued me into the fact that everything changes after 30. and everything flips. And was not psychologically prepared to be basically pursued, to be overwhelmed with kind of women that really wanted to settle down and have children and all this stuff. And, he's kind of, I don't want to say he's mentally frail, but it's just he can't deal with that stress. And so at 35, I just noticed he stopped dating. And, it's been a decade now. And, I've talked to him a couple of times and he's just, yeah, I'm just happy being single. I can't deal with the stress of the modern dating market. And this is a guy who gets a lot of like inquiries, or he did 10 years ago, and he quit because it was just too stressful for him. Now, in an alternate universe, like perhaps he would have had a matchmaker, like, arranged marriage. I don't know. Like, it sounds crazy for me to say, but I think this is a guy who, in a less like high intensity dating market, would actually have settled down. He just couldn't deal with like all like the psychological pressures of it. And again, this is a guy who didn't have a problem getting dates. That was actually the issue. It was just too much coming at him and too many demands, and he didn't know what to say to these women because, his honest answer would be like, I don't know if it's going to work out. But like, they don't want to hear that. Like, I mean, they're looking, they're in it to win it. And so like they would get offended and all this stuff, and, ask him why he didn't want to settle down. And he was like a guy who, I mean, he'd had some relationships in his 20s, but, it was just like he had not had to deal with this at all in his 20s because he was just a poor graduate student, And so he had no preparation for it to like flip on a dime, and he was a wanted commodity, and it just stressed him out. It literally stressed him out. And so now he has his hobbies of woodworking and riding his bike, and that's what he does with his free time instead of like raising a family. So it's kind of sad because I've known this guy since I was 18. He's a really good guy. He's obviously smart, a little eccentric, but the market, the culture is not set up for someone like him.
Yeah, and it seems like there's very few people who the culture is set up for. Like in terms of women on the female side, it's just it's a massacre. It's very very hard, because it's just kind of one of those things. At least the guys with the high leverage position, at least if they want to get off the roller coaster, they can. But for a lot of women, it's like it's just maddening because they've had relationships in their 20s, and they're like, okay, I'm just going to continue my career, serial monogamy for a little bit of time, and now in my 30s, I've been told that it's time to settle down. This is okay, it's this is the time, and then the market flips quite suddenly.
Yeah. That's the impression I get. Also, it depends on where you live and all of these other things. I mean, there's all these parameters. I think like, getting this stuff done early reduces a lot of lifetime stress. Even if like you get married at 25 and you get divorced at 45, for example, I mean, that's a key period of your life when you're supposed to be married, to be frank. It's supposed to be kind of in a relationship and having kids and, raising a family. So I definitely, like, I was actually literally talking to a friend yesterday. You don't know him, but you've probably seen his Twitter handle. You probably recognize it, but I'm not going to say who it is. But, high net worth individual. And, he's basically ending a relationship because he doesn't want to settle down yet, and I was kind of giving him a hard time about it. But, like he has his own, trade-offs, risk reward trade-offs that he's making. But it's just sad because I think like 4 years from now, he'll probably look back and think, why didn't he settle down? It's just, I mean, there's only so much partying and fun you can have. And he's had a lot of it, so I think he thinks that there's more out there, but there's probably not.
Yeah, that's the thing. Even with partying, there comes a day where, it's just the reward pattern, the utility function. It's not the same anymore. You just kind of get, it's the novelty of it wears off. Maybe not for everyone, obviously. I don't want to generalize, but yeah, it's like, how long can you keep this up? How long can your liver keep this up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, I like to have fun, but like I said, like I'm kind of like a spectator to all this because I've been in a monogamous like relationship since the early 2000s, and so it's like just seeing the whole 21st century kind of like go by has been interesting to me, but it's only an academic interest. I don't have any skin in the game.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think you made a good decision just from my vantage point.
Yeah, I mean, hindsight. This is definitely like hindsight, where it's like I wouldn't have known what decision I was making then. We didn't know in the early 2000s what was going on, right? Like we didn't know the Alex. It's like I've said this before. It's like I remember the internet in the 1990s, and we thought the internet in the 1990s was going to be like, oh my God, you get to talk to people in Ethiopia and Macedonia and have like interesting conversations. And, all these ideas are going to flow and information is going to be free. And it turns out 1/3 of the internet is just masturbation. And then a lot of the other third of the internet is, just like people screaming at each other about some like whatever, controversy of the day. And then the other third of the internet is ad blocking, advertisements you want to ad block. So like our utopian visions of the 1990s were really, really off in certain ways, and we didn't anticipate what was gonna be unleashed. And I'm obviously exaggerating a bit. We're talking now over a computer, and there's all sorts of things. But you have to like make the proactive choice to seek that stuff out instead of like getting high and then like watching porn all day, which like I've known of people who've gotten trapped in that rabbit hole, or I had a friend who was like who's a social justice warrior for a while, and I asked him like why he did that. He's just depressed, and just like shitting on people made him feel better. Like once he fixed his depression, once he got that solved, he realized he didn't want to do that wasn't really a good use of his time, and that he was only doing it because he felt crappy about himself. So I don't know. Like I was actually curious. I asked him like, why do you behave like this? Because I don't generally try to behave like that, but there are a lot of people on the internet who do, and it's not just on the left; it's on the right. Like there's a lot of frog Nazi types, and I'm assuming that they're mostly just like incel losers. So that's just a reality. Like they're unhappy with themselves, they're unhappy with their situation, and they just take it out on the rest of the world that just is trying to carry on.
Yeah, I think it's it's very easy to to get dopamine out of these tribal allegiances and kind of the simulated battle that you have online, and it feels really important. Like it feels like you're and I'm guilty of it as well. Like it feels like you're really debating the future of the planet. It's like it's our team, the red versus blue team, and
Yeah.
it feels really weighty while you're engaging in it. And you're
it's our evolved psychology kicking in, right? It's our evolved psychology. So we just need to figure out ways to like short circuit that, and like we're all messing up in some way, and we just as long as we acknowledge it and we're trying to like strive towards something better, I think it's doable. It's just you need to acknowledge the problem first, which some people don't want to do. Like some people are like, well, this is good actually. Like this sort of behavior. There are people who say that, and you don't need that to be a majority of people. You just need that to be enough people who actually believe that this is good, that they'll devote all their time to this behavior. And it just overwhelms the system. So this is like Pareto principle power law, 10% of bad actors can produce 9.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Cool. Yeah, it had a little bit of a interference. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's it's one of those one of those things to do, especially now with COVID bunker life. Kind of the online world's taken an outsized role in our lives. Another thing I want to ask you about, as being a prominent brown person and an advocate and activist on your side. How is it that brown guys are taking over the world? Because I've noticed this in tech. This is a thing.
Wait. Why are you saying that? Like, did you see me tweet that?
I think it was in your tweets, but I was like, yeah, this is a thing, and I feel like no one's really talking about it.
Yeah, so my wife was saying this because she's basically like, you need to like write about it. I'm just like, how many like groups am I gonna get like angry at me? I mean, there's got to be a limit of what I can handle. Yeah, so she was saying that too. So anyways, go on.
No, but it's I don't know. It's one of those things that it's not like polite to notice, obviously, because it's something that is tied to ethnicity, and even noticing anything is a bit weird. But like I've worked in tech and I've worked in finance, and at the intersection of tech and finance, you have a lot of founders, a lot of people who are either South Asian, they're either Bangladeshi, they come from a very particular part of Asia, and it's a lot of times people who are in leadership positions who have a lot of initiative, and they're making stuff, and they're making stuff all over the West. And Silicon Valley has a crazy preponderance of guys from India. So I'm curious, like what is this, and why is no one talking about it? I mean, I know why people aren't talking about it, but why is it? What's
Yeah, I
the
mean,
combination?
I think in terms of what it is and like there's a PNAS paper about why South Asians are doing better in management than East Asians. But I think you also like there was an article in Politico recently about like Asian Americans getting involved in politics, and it was all about East Asians. Well, why was it about East Asians? Because I mean, you have people like Ro Khanna, Pramila Jayapal that are pretty prominent in Congress, and of course the vice president is her mother is a Tamil Brahmin. Or was a Tamil Brahmin. And so I don't think anybody would ask, like, how are South Asians going to get involved in politics? You have Nikki Haley on the other side, who's going to be a likely contender. So that's just not an issue. So I think between South and East Asians, I think there's a cultural personality difference. I think East Asian societies are more into politeness. And, when my father came to the United States, they gave them like kind of some cultural primers about like how to basically get along with the majority of society. And like one thing they said is a lot of Asians, they think when you're talking to someone who's a superior, looking down and not making eye contact is respectful. But Americans think you're hiding something.
Mm-hmm.
So overwhelm your instinct and look at them in the eye. Okay. And so there's things like this that I think probably affect East Asians getting higher up in the management. South Asians, a lot of brown dudes, were pretty aggressive, really verbally oriented, and our personalities are a little bit more outgoing. I think there's difference within the subcontinent. South Indians tend to have a reputation to be a little less boisterous than North Indians, particularly Punjabis. Every brown person who's listening to this knows exactly what I'm saying. But in any case, it's still within a range, I think, of like behavior and kind of just like the social expectations that fit in well with I'll call it white Anglo culture, because that was the hegemonic culture of Silicon Valley, and I think it was kind of on the same plane. In the level of like consensus, the way consensus and decisions are made in East Asian societies, I just wonder if it doesn't gel well. And so over time, I wouldn't be surprised if, like, as more and more of the East Asians are, born and raised in the United States, there's less of a divergence. I think part of this is just that if you have immigrants from China and immigrants from India, the ones from India come from a much more chaotic society where people have to be more interpersonally aggressive, and that works well in the United States in terms of just like, if you talk, you'll be noticed. If you talk, you'll be noted. And if you don't talk, you'll just kind of disappear, and people won't even think of you. And so I think the prominence, especially like, subcontinental men in places like tech, it's like a combination of skills, aptitude, orientation, but also I think like a cultural fit. And, I've talked to a couple of white guys about this too, where they just say, they've been pretty candid privately with me, like, yeah, we're kind of more comfortable with brown guys than East Asians, because East Asians are just like they're like Chinese colleagues, are just quieter. They don't vocalize as much. So if you're talking about like a social situation, they're like, well, I mean, Indians from India, they can kind of speak English. They're really different, but they're just more talkative and outgoing, so it's just more comfortable interacting with them in non-work situations. And as you know, a lot of connections are made in these non-work situations. So that's my intuition of what's going on. I think it's probably driven by a personality difference. A lot of the brown people that you obviously meet are also they had a high status in the subcontinent, and like they literally had like, families of servants living with them and stuff like that. So these are like, not all of them, like some of them come from poorer families that engage in upward mobility, but a huge number of them have really, really elite connections to, whether it's like some upper caste or some business class or, whatever. And so they're porting their kind of like social capital and their elite connections just to the United States. There is some homophily, so there's some issue where like certain subgroups of Indians they kind of coordinate together to do startups or do projects because they're comfortable with each other. They have like a native language that they speak. Some white people in the Valley are convinced that there's like a brown conspiracy. I do have to say that that's a little much because if brown people were capable of these sorts of cohesive conspiracies, the subcontinent would look a lot different. They're just like there's just way too much heterogeneity for it to be kind of a situation where like, oh well, we're gonna hire our own kind because like, to be frank, like a South Indian Brahmin and a North Indian Punjabi Jat, they don't actually think of themselves as quote their own kind. Like they don't really have like the same sort of like affinity that you would expect just based on you coding them as Indian, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with personality. It has to do with the social capital that they're bringing, and stuff like that. And it's these sorts of like discursive and verbose tendencies are super useful in the Valley because you have the technical skills, you could code, but then you also have to pitch. Okay, you have to pitch to raise money. You have to like promote, market yourself. Like Steve Jobs was not like a great programmer. He was. He presented a vision, and so if you can present like a charismatic vision, your company can go far. So I think that those are the things that I believe. I mean, if you just look at the numbers, there's a lot of subcontinental people in a globalized world. They're just going to become more and more prominent. As for why people aren't talking about it, at least in a direct way, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the hegemonic idea of white supremacy, like it's kind of an inconvenient fact, and so they don't really want to like admit that white supremacy is like, to be frank, it's not really that determinative, because right now the idea in the United States is like everything is due to systemic racism and structural and white supremacy, and I just think that's actually false, to be frank. And I think, stuff like in the Valley shows how it's false, where you have like a bunch of people who don't, they speak English with an accent. They're not really fluent in the culture, but they're aggressive. They have some skills and they believe in themselves, and boom, look what's happening. That kind of falsifies the narrative, and it's not something that the mainstream wants to accept. I mean, like 10, 15 years ago, I think it would be even in the 90s, people were much more open to it because we didn't have this theology that white supremacy determines everything. So in the 90s and the 2000s, they'd be like, oh, look at all these immigrants starting startups and stuff like that. But now I don't think they really want to admit that these people have any talent or skill that's special. It's just because they're white adjacent or multiracial white. Like, this is like a common experience where it's like people are just like, well, it's because you're actually white, like you're part of the white power structure, you're using the white power structure, and it's just like, this is just like, stupid. It's just stupid, but this is just the world we live in. And that's why there are people who are Indian who are going back. Like, obviously the ones that were born and raised there, like, come here, make some money, and then go back. But, I mean, we probably know people, I know people, you probably do too, who are, like, born and raised in the United States who are thinking of leaving and going back to India or somewhere in Asia because they just see more opportunities there.
Yeah.
It's a hot... Yeah, go ahead.
It's also an interesting phenomenon to see that a lot of, like, very virulent woke people, I think especially women, are from the subcontinent. I mean, is there something to be noticed there? Is there a pattern? Because it seems like
that's the thing. That's the thing. Multiple friends of mine DM me about that. They're just like, dude, like, what is up with that? So I mean, I think part of it again is a lot of these women, they're leveraging what American society gives them. So their parents could be doctors, upper middle class, they went to Columbia, I don't know. But American society tells them they have brown skin, so they're marginalized. So they have really high verbal skills. They're in it to win it, and American society just gave them a chainsaw. So they're just
Okay.
going. They're doing. I don't think it's ethical. I really dislike it, and I try to call it out sometimes because I'm just like, look, I know that your ancestors like had servants that would like take their crap out for like 300 years, like literally. Like there's castes that like deal in feces, right? And it's like these people like they were at the top of a hierarchy that was like, pretty exploitative in a lot of ways, and sometimes they'll like self-flagellate about that. But I mean, my issue is so the idea is in American society, all that matters is your whiteness, and so we don't have whiteness, therefore we're marginalized. I think that's just empirically wrong. But the problem is, like, what do you do when you're an atheist in a society that's Christian? So that's where we are today, where I can say that like I never perceived myself as like I knew I was more privileged than a lot of the people that I grew up with who were white, but that's like saying that the devil is good to a Christian. Like it doesn't compute to a lot of Americans now because they've been indoctrinated into this idea that whiteness is like this magical thing. Like white skin is like magic fairy dust and it makes you a naturally successful person. Just ignore your eyes and like what you read about white life expectancy, the immiseration of the white working class, the opioid epidemic, all of these things. Just ignore all of that. Like who has, a graduate degree and whose parents are doctors, who is from like an elite like stratum of South Asian society, you're actually the marginalized one. Like this is what the ideology is telling them, and so a lot of them just run with it. Now, privately, there's this faction where it's just like they know they're being fake, but then they'll say like, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" Like this is just the tool that this is like the leverage that I'm being given. The society is insane, right? So I think that's why that's going on. Just like Asians in general, East Asians do it too. I don't think they frankly pull it off as well. Just again, this is kind of like the verbal pugilism that South Asians are capable of. It's a toxic combination with the tools of the current paradigm of white supremacy, because basically Priya from Brookline is an extremely privileged human being, but she's being told and validated by all of society that she's actually underprivileged and she can just like destroy people verbally wherever she wants. And I've had friends who are in academia where it's like when they see in a non-science class, when they see a discussion section and there's a brown woman, like they shiver with fear because they know she could just like look at, if they're a white male, she could just look at them and just start talking at them about how they're oppressive, and they just have to just kind of nod and go along because like they have no tools, so they can't punch down. That's how it's perceived. Now, again, these people aren't stupid. Like she knows that she's privileged, and he knows that she's privileged, but you can't say that. You just can't say that because certain truths cannot be acknowledged in our American society, and that's just how it is. I mean, I say it, but people either ignore me or they get mad at me, or they just say I'm crazy.
Yeah,
So I'm not.
why do you say it? Why is it you that is saying it? Like, what animates you to say the unsayable?
Well, I mean, people tell me people tell me I should say it, so I do. I mean, it's just what everyone thinks. I mean, I don't know. It's just like. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, everyone has a price. Like, I'll go woke for like for Elon type money. I mean, there's a price. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you show me the cash, like I'll say whatever you want me to say. But at this point, no one's like offering me money to conform, so I'm not going to conform. Like I'm just going to say what I think is true. And a lot of people agree with me. I don't know. It's just like a compulsion. I've always been like that, and so. It's kind of one of the things when you see like preference falsification constructs. I just like to point it out, and then like privately people just laugh and they're like, "Yeah, that's exactly what's going on there." Because I don't like this fakery that we see in American society, and I also think the fakery is destructive. There's certain fake constructs that maybe elevate where you aspire. So, for example, a lot of parents say you should judge people on their insides, not their outsides. That's fake. Most people want to get with someone that's as good looking as possible, blah, blah, blah. But that's a good sentiment. And I still think that people should aspire to it. And there are people that I know who actually lived that. And I think a lot of us admire them, or we used to. I don't know. Maybe people laugh at them now. But I've known of situations where, yeah, they took that to heart. They did that. I'm just like, damn, that's like that's like we would say, that's a saintly person. Like, that's a person that you would want to be. But it's kind of fake. But it's a good thought. It's a good ideal to strive for. I think a lot of the fakery today, it's just destructive. So the idea that if you are a white person, that your skin color and your racial status gives you like magical superpowers, it's fake, but I think it's really destructive. It's destructive to white people. It's destructive to non-white people, all around. Like I have friends who are in academia who come from working class backgrounds, and they think that now that they have tenure and whatever, well, since they're white, they're just assimilated into the upper bourgeois, the lower bourgeois, whatever, the upper middle class, right? And I actually think that's false. I think economists like Grant Clark have shown why that's false. Like there's some evidence that class status is more persistent than that. But I can't really get through to them because they've been told that if you're white and you make enough money, you're automatically assimilated. And I'm like, bro, like you don't have the social networks, you don't have the social connections, just some of the things you say, just your social cues, they're implicitly telling people what your class status is. Like, it's not just your skin color. It's not like people don't know, it's like they know, and you're never gonna create the social network that some of your other colleagues that are white who have the same occupational status as you have, and so your kids are not going to benefit in the same way as their kids would benefit. So this is kind of an empirical argument that I'm making based on economic history and social science, but it just goes over people's heads, and these are academics, they're just annoying. They're just like, well, we were taught that it's white supremacy, and yes, there is class issues, but if you're a white person who becomes upper middle class, you're just like all the other upper middle class white people. And I'm saying, no, actually, you're not like all the upper middle class white people. That's just factually not true, and here's the evidence, and it just causes annoyance, But I think it's destructive for them not to understand that their kids they can't be passive. Because like their kids don't have the same advantages as the other white professors, for example. I think it is destructive for them. And as for like non-white people, I think it causes fatalism. I think it causes dissension. I think it causes hatred. There are like Asian American males that I know who have issues with dating, and they blame their race when the reality is they're obese and they don't really have much of an engaging personality, right? And so they blame these big structural forces for things that they can actually control. And so like they've given themselves over to passivity and hopelessness and fatalism. And so I think fatalism is a huge issue with these overwhelming deterministic sociological models that we promote overall. And like this is not just with our current hegemonic system of systemic racism, white supremacy, and all that stuff. Like in general, Marxism had a weird fatalistic, trend too. Like you just sit back and let history go, right? That didn't really work out. So I think we need to avoid fatalism and continue to strive to be better. And when you have ideologies that encourage fatalism, and I think, currently we have fatalism and complacency, those two things.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's learned helplessness at a societal scale. I also wanted to ask you the last question, because I know we're coming up on time here. It's do you have a subversive thinker, someone who's influenced your thinking, could be living or dead, that you'd like to recommend to people because you're not getting enough airtime? Like that they should be a bit more known about.
Let me think. A subversive. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, subversive is the key because, like, I feel like the people that I'm interested in are not often subversive. Well, I mean, I do think. I mean, your audience is probably familiar with Leo Strauss, but I do think Leo Strauss's insights about basically cryptic knowledge and writing in a way that's esoteric. I thought it was crazy when I first encountered it. But I first encountered it in the 1990s, which I feel was like a much more open time. And today, with thought police, sometimes literally, as in England, I think it is much more useful to be able to communicate in an esoteric way with a select subset and use public channels. Like you can communicate in plain sight, right? And so Leo Strauss's core thesis is that the ancients wrote in basically a code for the elite peers, and then they wrote in a more exoteric way, like more like superficial way for the general public, right? And whether he was right in the details or not is irrelevant to me. I think that general framework of thinking is much more useful than I would have thought when I was young. Partly because I was probably captured by the idea of the Whiggish idea of history, and that we were going to this liberal end of history, and everyone was going to be open-minded and tolerant and all that stuff. We're way less tolerant now in the 2020s than we were in the 2000s and the 1990s. It was a much more open time intellectually, and people would entertain all sorts of ideas, and you could just be free and open to say what you wanted to say. Today, that's just not possible. You have to speak in code. You have to signal whoever you are. You have to just kind of make people aware, but not everybody, because there's people out there out to get you. And so I think that insight is pretty deep, and I think people should take it much more seriously. And I say this from experience, because I think it's for an American, I think it's a bizarre idea. It's a bizarre concept, because we are the home of the brave, the land of the free. That's our marketing, and I think a lot of us growing up take it to heart. And this just seems cowardly and bizarre and weird, but it's actually quite useful. And I think it's been pretty common across many societies. Because the norm of human affairs has not been kind of like open-minded liberalism.
Yeah, it isn't even under open-minded liberalism, which teaches you a little bit about human affairs. Yeah, is this your way of telling everyone that you are writing in code and that we should start, interpreting your writing in a deeper, more esoteric way?
Exactly. I don't know. I don't know. Sometimes people tweet at me and they're like, "I don't understand what you're saying," and I just respond, "Exactly."
Yeah.
Because if you don't understand what I'm saying, I don't want you to understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, this is a rule of Twitter. Never explain. Yeah.
Yeah. It's that's the issue though. Is Twitter is it's obviously it's toxic in a lot of ways. We all know it. We all understand it. But it's so useful in other ways, and so I'm trying to figure out ways to still continue to use it without being caught up into the toxicity. And I think being esoteric really helps, because the people that I want to communicate with generally understand what I'm saying, and everybody else who might be triggered, they just scratch their head. You know what I'm saying? They have no idea. And so for example, I talk about the Kali Yuga a lot, and I mean, if you're Indian, you know what that means. But if you're not Indian, you don't. Although a lot of people who follow me closely now know what I mean, know what I'm saying. I'm saying some pretty harsh things about American society, really harsh things. But most of the people following me have no idea what I'm saying, and so they're just going along on their way. And I'm not offending their sensibilities, and I'm not ruining their day. But the other people who I want to understand, they understand what I'm actually saying, that we are at the end, and this is a perverted state of the way the world should be in terms of human flourishing. And this is why we are the richest people in the history of the world, with supercomputers in our pockets, but so many of us are miserable. There's some serious ethical problems, cultural problems that we have in our society that we're not confronting. And so I think a lot of people don't want to hear it. A lot of people want to hear that we're getting better. It gets better. There was a thing in the late 2000s, early teens, the It Gets Better project, about how it gets better from when you're a teenager. And there was some truth to that, but really what the 2020s is probably showing us is it doesn't get better. It gets worse. It gets crueler. It gets harsher. It gets raw. And this is where we are. So, I'm an optimistic person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I echo your sentiment about the Kali Yuga and about being esoteric on the TL. It does help, and also not explaining. Like you said,
Yeah,
it separates the wheat from the chaff, and we want to keep the wheat, and that's fine. So thanks so much, Razib. This was really enjoyable. I'm happy we made it happen, and yeah, I'm glad to have you on.
awesome. It was nice meeting you, Alex.